Why did people once think using a fork was wrong? It sounds strange to us now. We just pick up a fork without a thought. It's a normal part of eating, but for a long, long time it was not normal. In fact, some people thought it was a very bad thing. They saw it as sinful. They even thought it was demonic. This idea seems wild today. But it made sense to people back then. To understand why, we need to look at how people ate before forks came along. We need to see what beliefs they held. The world before forks was quite different. People ate in ways that might surprise us. Most meals were eaten with hands. That sounds messy, maybe. But people were used to it. They had ways to manage it. Think about it. For thousands of years, humans ate with their fingers. It was natural. It was how everyone did it. When you ate with your hands, you learned how to be neat. You learned how to pick up food politely, and it wasn't just hands. People also used other tools. Spoons were common. They helped with liquids like soup or stew. Knives were also used. They cut up meat or other tough foods, but the knife was mostly for preparing food or cutting it into smaller pieces. Not so much for lifting food to the mouth. So a typical meal often involved your hands, maybe a spoon, and a knife for cutting. That was it. This way of eating worked perfectly fine for centuries. People didn't feel like they were missing anything. They didn't think, oh, if only I had a two-pronged tool to pick up this meat. The food was often prepared in a way that made it easy to eat with hands. Stews, roasted meats, bread, vegetables, all could be managed. It was a shared experience too. Often, people ate from common platters. They would reach in and take their share. This was a communal thing. It built bonds. It was part of the social fabric. Hygiene was a concern, of course. People didn't just eat with dirty hands. They often washed their hands before and during meals. Sometimes, servants would bring water and towels for washing. This was a sign of good manners. It was a way to keep things clean. So the idea that eating with hands was inherently dirty wasn't always true. It was just a different set of customs. People managed their cleanliness in other ways. The act of eating was seen as a very basic human thing. It was about nourishing the body. It was about sharing. It was about community. God had given humans hands. These hands are perfect tools for eating. Why would you need something else? Why would you invent a new tool when your own body parts did the job? This simple idea was at the heart of much of the resistance. It felt almost like saying God's design was not good enough. So, when the fork first showed up, it wasn't seen as an improvement. It was seen as something strange. It was seen as unnecessary. It was seen as going against tradition. It was new. And new things, especially when they challenged deep-seated customs, often met with suspicion. People were comfortable with their old ways, like they didn't see a problem. And sometimes, when people don't see a problem, they resist solutions, especially if those solutions come with a strange new object. The fork, this odd new tool, started to appear in certain places. It didn't just pop up everywhere all at once. It had a specific journey. Its true origins are a bit hazy, but we know it got some traction in the Byzantine Empire. This was the Eastern Roman Empire, a place known for its refinement and luxury. People there were often ahead of their time in terms of culture and innovation. Imagine this, it's the 11th century. A Byzantine princess, Maria Argyropoulina, travels to Venice. She is marrying a Venetian doge's son. She brings with her a lot of luxurious items. And among them is this strange little golden tool. It has two prongs. She uses it to eat. Instead of using her hands, she uses this tool to pick up food. This was a big deal. The Venetians were shocked. They had never seen anything like it. Eating with a fork was totally new to them. It looked very odd, and it caused quite a stir. People found it very unusual, maybe even a bit scandalous. This wasn't just about manners. It quickly became about something deeper. The religious leaders were particularly bothered. One famous example is Peter Damian. He was an Italian cardinal, a very respected man of God. He wrote about this princess and her strange eating habits. He saw her use of the fork as a sign of excessive luxury. He saw it as a sign of sinful pride. He believed God had given us hands to eat with. To use a tool instead was an insult to God. It was like saying God's gifts weren't good enough. When Maria Argyropoulina later died, Peter Damian wrote about it. He said her death was a punishment from God. He linked her death directly to her, excessive delicacy. He specifically mentioned her use of this golden fork. For him, it was clear. God was angry about this new, unnatural way of eating. This shows how seriously some people took it. It wasn't just an odd habit. It was a moral failing. It was a challenge to divine order. So the early resistance wasn't just about people being set in their ways. It was about deeply held religious beliefs. It was about what was natural and what was unnatural. God had made humans with hands. Hands were for eating. To use a man-made tool to replace what God had provided seemed arrogant. It seemed like questioning God's wisdom. And think about the symbolism. A fork, especially a two-pronged one, looked a bit like a pitchfork. And what did the devil carry in many old stories? A pitchfork. This visual connection, even if it wasn't always consciously made, might have added to the negative feeling. It made the fork seem like something from the underworld, something associated with evil. This early resistance was strong. The fork was seen as a symbol of decadence. It was for the overly refined, the proud, those who indulged in luxury too much. It wasn't for honest, God-fearing people. It was a foreign object brought by foreigners, used in a way that seemed to defy common sense and religious piety. This set the stage for centuries of resistance in many parts of Europe. It wasn't just a slow adoption. It was active rejection based on powerful beliefs. The religious objections against the fork were quite strong. They weren't just about table manners, they went much deeper than that. For many people, especially religious leaders, using a fork was seen as a direct challenge to God. God had created humans with hands. These hands were perfect tools for eating. To invent a new tool, like the fork, seemed to imply that God's design was somehow flawed. It felt like saying, we can do better than what God gave us. This was seen as a sign of extreme pride, a very serious sin. Think about the context of the time. In many societies, religion was at the center of everything. People believed God was involved in every aspect of their lives. So, something as fundamental as eating, nourishing the body God had created, naturally fell under religious scrutiny. If you were eating in a way that seemed to go against divine will, it was a problem. The fork was seen as a tool of excessive refinement and luxury. In a world where many people struggled with poverty, showing off with a fancy new utensil seemed arrogant. It spoke of gluttony and indulgence. These were also considered sins. Simplicity, humility, and moderation were highly valued. The fork, with its newness and its association with wealthy foreign royalty, symbolized the exact opposite of these virtues. And then there was the more direct demonic association. This isn't just a modern interpretation. It was quite real for some people. The early forks often had two prongs. This shape, whether intentionally or not, resembled a pitchfork. And what was the most common image of the devil? A creature carrying a pitchfork. So, the fork could be seen as an instrument of the devil. It was a tool that mimicked the devil's weapon. It felt unholy. It felt like inviting evil to the table. Peter Damian, the cardinal we talked about, wasn't just being dramatic. He genuinely believed that the Byzantine princess who used a fork was sinning. He linked her death to God's judgment. He saw her excessive delicacy as a moral failing. For him, the fork was a symbol of her spiritual corruption. This was a very serious condemnation. It wasn't just about being impolite, it was about risking your soul. In some cases, people believed that using a fork was literally an act of sacrilege. It was seen as taking food away from God's direct blessing. When you ate with your hands, you were closer to the food, closer to the earth that provided it, closer to the natural process. A fork, being an artificial intermediary, created a distance. This distance was sometimes interpreted as a rejection of the natural order, a rejection of God's direct provision. The idea that, anything new or foreign could be linked to evil was also common. In many conservative societies, tradition was paramount. Anything that broke from tradition was viewed with suspicion. If it came from a foreign land, especially one perceived as decadent or spiritually lax, it was even more suspect. The fork, coming from the Byzantine Empire, a place that was culturally different and sometimes viewed with suspicion by Western Europeans, fit this pattern perfectly. So the resistance was deeply rooted. It wasn't just a matter of taste or preference. It was a matter of faith, morality, and even fear of the demonic. People genuinely believed that using a fork was wrong. They believed it could bring down God's wrath. They believed it was a tool associated with the devil himself. This strong opposition meant that the fork faced an uphill battle for acceptance for a very long time in many parts of Europe. It wasn't just a silly quirk of history. It was a serious cultural and religious struggle. Beyond the religious worries, there were also many social and cultural reasons why the fork didn't catch on quickly. It wasn't just that people thought it was sinful, they also found it strange, awkward, and sometimes even rude. It was a big change in how people had always done things, and people often resist change, especially when it comes to basic, everyday actions like eating. One big barrier was simply tradition and etiquette. For centuries, eating with your hands or with a spoon for liquids was the norm. It was considered polite to eat in this way. People had developed specific manners for hand eating. For example, you learn to take small pieces of food. You learn to keep your hands relatively clean. You learn not to grab too much from a shared dish. These were all part of good upbringing. Suddenly, this new tool appeared. It broke all those established rules. How were you supposed to hold it? How were you supposed to use it without looking silly? People felt clumsy using it. Forks, especially early ones, were not very user-friendly. They often had only two prongs, which made it hard to pick up certain foods. Imagine trying to eat peas with a two-pronged fork. It would be a frustrating experience. So the learning curve was steep. People felt more comfortable and graceful using their hands. There was also a perception that using a fork was effeminate or pretentious. In some cultures, especially those that valued rugged masculinity, using a delicate utensil seemed unmanly. It was seen as a sign of weakness or over-refinement. Real men, they might have thought, ate with their hands. It was direct, it was strong. This kind of thinking made men, in particular, resistant to adopting the fork. And they didn't want to be seen as soft or overly concerned with dainty manners. And the fork was definitely seen as a symbol of status, but not always in a good way. When it first appeared, only the very rich or the most fashion-conscious aristocrats used it. This created a social divide. For the common people, the fork was a symbol of the elite, of those who were too good to eat like everyone else. It was an object of snobbery. So instead of wanting to emulate the rich by using a fork, many people actively rejected it as a symbol of their class. They preferred to stick to their own, more humble and traditional ways of eating. Different countries also had different levels of resistance. Italy was one of the first places outside Byzantium where the fork started to gain some traction, especially in the more refined courts of Venice and Florence. But even there, it was a slow process. In other places like France and England, the resistance was much stronger and lasted much longer. In France, for instance, it was largely Catherine de' Medici who tried to popularize the fork when she brought it from Italy in the 16th century. But even with the queen promoting it, it took a very long time for it to become common. French people often found it silly and unnecessary. They preferred their knives and fingers. In England, forks were introduced even later, mostly in the 17th century, and again they were met with ridicule. For travelers who brought forks back from Italy were often mocked. They were called effeminate or too Italianate. People saw it as a foreign affectation. They preferred their good old English ways. It was a matter of national pride, in a way. Why adopt a strange foreign custom when your own traditions were perfectly good? So the fork had to overcome a lot. It had to deal with religious condemnations, but also with deep-seated social norms, issues of perceived masculinity, class distinctions, and national pride. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about identity, tradition, and how people saw themselves and their place in the world. The fork was asking people to change a very fundamental part of their daily lives, and for a long time, most people just weren't ready to do it. Despite all the resistance, the fork eventually did become a common eating tool. It was a very, very slow change, taking centuries in some places, but attitudes did shift. The reasons for this change were a mix of practical benefits, evolving social norms, and the slow march of fashion. One of the big practical benefits was simple hygiene. As cities grew and people lived closer together, concerns about cleanliness increased. Eating with hands, even with washing, could be seen as less sanitary. A fork kept your hands clean. It kept them away from the food you were eating and from the common serving dishes. This became more important as ideas about public health started to develop. Another practical benefit was handling hot food. Imagine eating a piece of very hot roasted meat with your bare hands. It's difficult. Fork made it much easier to manage hot items. This wasn't a huge driver at first, but it certainly was a useful aspect once people started to get used to the tool. It added comfort to the meal. Social etiquette also evolved. What was once considered refined and exclusive eventually became a standard expectation. As more and more aristocratic families started using forks, it slowly became a symbol of good breeding and sophistication. People who wanted to appear cultured and modern began to adopt it. It became a mark of status, but this time in a positive way. If you wanted to dine with the upper classes, you needed to know how to use a fork. Cookbooks and etiquette guides played a role too. As these types of books became more popular, they started to include instructions on how to use a fork. They promoted it as the proper way to eat. These guides helped to standardize table manners and made the fork seem less like an oddity and more like an essential part of dining. They taught people not just what to eat, but how to eat it. The design of the fork itself also improved. Early forks often had two prongs, which were indeed difficult to use for many foods. But over time, forks developed three prongs, and then the four prongs that are common today. This made them much more effective at picking up a wider variety of foods, from peas to pasta. A better tool was easier to adopt. Different countries caught on at different rates. As we mentioned, Italy was earlier, but even there, it wasn't universal for a long time. France slowly adopted it over centuries, and by the 18th century, it was quite common among the elite. England was even later, with the fork only becoming widely accepted in the 18th and 19th centuries, eventually becoming indispensable. The shift wasn't a sudden moment, it was a gradual generational change. Children who saw their parents or other important adults using forks would grow up thinking it was normal. The initial shock and religious condemnation slowly faded as people became more accustomed to the sight of forks. The demonic association eventually seemed quaint and old-fashioned. The idea of sinful gave way to practicality and fashion. The irony of it all is quite striking. A tool once seen as an insult to God, a symbol of demonic influence and sinful pride, is now one of the most basic and unquestioned items in our kitchens. We don't think twice about grabbing a fork to eat, it's just a tool, it's functional. It's part of our everyday lives. This history shows us how deeply cultural and religious beliefs can shape even the most mundane aspects of life. It reminds us that what seems completely normal and obvious to us today might have been scandalous and shocking to people in the past. The fork's journey from a reviled object to a universal utensil is a fascinating story about human resistance, adaptation, and the slow, steady evolution of our customs and traditions. It's a testament to how even the strongest beliefs can change over time when faced with practicality and new social norms.